Welkom namens Nieuwspoort, Stichting Beeld en Geluid, de gemeente Den Haag, bij deze bijeenkomst voor de Dutch Media Week. We hebben vandaag een ronde tafelgesprek met buitenlandse correspondenten, standplaats Nederland. De voertaal van dit gesprek gaat Engels worden, so I'll switch to English. One exception will be our French colleague Antoine, who's afraid that his English is worse than his Dutch, so he will do it in Dutch. But I think we all understand it as we should, because we're all stationed here in the Netherlands. I'll introduce myself as well. My name is Stephanie van den Berg. I am a Dutch journalist, but I've worked all my life for international media, and I'm currently the correspondent for Reuters in the Netherlands. And I'll do a bit of a very Dutch voorstelrondje, and we'll start with Molly. Can you tell us, well, about who you are, what media you work for, how long you've been in the Netherlands? Start with.
My name is Molly Quell. I am from the US originally. I've lived in the Netherlands for 10 years, almost 10 years now. I work predominantly for a US wire service called Courthouse News, which is aptly titled. We do court reporting. Mostly I cover international courts. And I also I'm a contributing editor at Dutch News, which is also aptly titled. I insist on only working for media outlets that are very clear in their name what they do. And we're a sort of new.nl, but for internationals in the Netherlands. So we cover kind of general Dutch news.
And Molly's also big on Twitter, which she's not saying now. We'll get into
I don't know about big on Twitter necessarily, but I occasionally make some sort of half-assed joke about the Dutch only liking salt as a seasoning, and then it goes viral, and I don't know, people get mad at me.
And Britta.
I'm Britta Behrendt. I'm German, and I'm working for the German public television, the ZDF. I've been in the Netherlands for 20 years now, but I've been working for the public television since 10 years almost. And we're covering everything, really, which comes in the German news.
And you're also the president of the Foreign Press Association.
That's right, yes.
Mentioned. And Antoine.
Dus ik ben Antoine Mousseau. Ik werk nu al 6 jaar lang als correspondent in Nederland voor Franstalige media. Dus ik werk vooral voor de Frans-Duitse televisieomroep Arte. Dan nog voor enkele Franstalige publieke radioomroepen in België, in Frankrijk, zoals in Zwitserland. En ik werk ook nog daartoe als correspondent voor meerdere Franstalige kranten in diezelfde landen. Dus,
Matt, do you want to...
I'm Matt Steinglass. My title is Europe Correspondent for The Economist, which means I mostly write articles about European subjects that have to do with several countries at once, but I also cover Scandinavia, I cover Eastern Europe and things like that. And the Netherlands, obviously. And I have been in the Netherlands off and on for 10 years. My wife is Dutch. I was the Financial Times correspondent in Amsterdam for a couple of years. I have a reasonably deep knowledge of Dutch politics at this point.
And do you want to then kick off this idea, like what you're all in the Netherlands for a long time? I've always, I'm a Dutch journalist, so obviously I'm Dutch, so I don't get some of the quirks or things that are weird for other foreign journalists, although I do have very much my pet peeves. As a Reuters journalist, I always have to get everybody's full name, and I'm forever asking whatever voorlichter there is for the first name of a judge who is presiding in some case, and they won't tell it to me because we just only give the letters, and why would you need his full name? And then I always have to Google them and find out the name anyway, because everybody has a Facebook page, even the judges. But what are some of the things that you run into?
I mean, I'm sure everybody is going to mention this issue of pre-approval of quotes and people asking you to read the piece before it's published, which is not an internationally recognized practice, but is recognized in the Netherlands. I mean, the funny thing is that actually at The Economist, we use so few quotes. They're usually about 3 words long, and it's okay for us to run them by people, but I am often sending people 3 or 4 words to approve, and it seems kind of aimless and pointless. But, if they want it, it's fine.
I always wonder if it's kind of testing me, or if they do this to everybody. But once you want to have an interview with a ministry or something, you call them and you finally reach the person who you need, and then you talk to them for quite some time, and in the end they say, "Oh, kan je dat nog even op de mail zetten?" Yes. And I always wonder, why do they do this to me? I mean, I have to write in Dutch, and it won't be better than what I just told you, but they always do this.
Yeah, you always have to put your questions in the mail, even though you've spent like 20 minutes getting to the right person, explaining it several times.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely second, I think, these sort of problems. The quotes thing really threw me for a loop the first time somebody asked to see the story before it was published. And I was like, no? No? Yeah, the names thing also gets me. I also find, I mean, this is more common in Europe, but we don't do this in the US, where they do the like partial names for defendants. I mean, I cover a lot of court stuff, so it's always like, you know, Joost Bay or something like this. And I think, yeah, this is ridiculous. Come on, you can go, everybody knows what this last guy's name is. Like, why are we doing this? But yeah, that's also a thing that I find a little strange.
Antoine, how is it? This is all like more English media. How
Ja,
is it?
ik heb hetzelfde gevoel van, ja, ten eerste gewoon die vraag van, kunnen we gewoon terug tegenlezen wat je geschreven hebt? Of, ik werk vooral voor voor televisieomroepen en radioomroepen. En ik kreeg ook dit verzoek, dus men heeft maar, de laatste keer was nog enkele weken geleden. Dat was van, ja, kunnen we de uitslag zien voor de uitzending, om ervoor zeker te zijn dat het, ja, dat je hebt alles goed vertaald. En dus helemaal geen vertrouwen, alsof ik zo ja, systematisch iets fout schrijven of vertalen. En ja, elke keer zeg ik dat kan niet, want ik zeg het altijd op die manier. Ik weet niet hoe het in Nederland is. Ik weet het eigenlijk wel, maar bij ons in Frankrijk doen we het op die manier niet. Het is gezien gewoon niet correct. Dat mag niet. Dat is het eerste wat we op de journalistenschool leren. Dat zeg ik constant. En dan ze kijken me altijd op een soort... ja, men voelt de schaamte. Maar die vraag krijg ik constant. En ik vind het best raar, want anders kunnen die mensen die je geïnterviewd hebt gewoon alles beïnvloeden, de inhoud van je reportage. En dat zou nooit nergens mogen, vooral niet in Nederland, die in de top van de wereldranking persvrijheid staat, dus op nummer 5. Zoiets had ik nooit verwacht voor ik naar Nederland verhuisd ben. Ja.
What I also found really weird is that when they turn you down, they won't tell you right away. They just don't call back, or they just play the waiting game until you give up. And that was new to me.
That may be international practice in some places. I don't know.
I don't know about that, of course. But once or several times I also got an answer that they said, well, we are not interested in it. And that was really weird, because I think, well, you as a ministry, for example, you kind of have or in my world, you are kind of obliged to answer to the public and to the press. But they said, no, we're not interested, and it's not in our interest. And that was really weird for me.
Do you find that, Matt? Because I find even with Reuters, I'm like, I worked for AFP for a long time, Agence France Presse, and it's the French news agency, and people don't know it, so they're like, some French newspaper. But then I thought, now I work for Reuters. Now I can say, you know, Reuters, and then they're all going to be like, yes, we'd love to talk to you, but no.
Right. I mean, no. For me, it's this is a subject that's associated with this issue of polarization. The populist parties obviously are not interested in being, unless, particularly they know the editorial standpoint of The Economist. They know it's not going to be a flattering piece. It's very difficult for me to get responses at this stage from builders, but that's true all over Europe at this stage of the populist parties.
Yeah.
Ministries are usually okay, and mainstream parties are.
Builders got, I guess, worse in that. In the beginning, he would talk to foreign media, even though he wouldn't talk to Dutch media, and now he's kind of seemed to have expanded this policy to all media, where he can just talk directly on Twitter. If we segue into the theme of polarization. If we do a bit of a round, how do you feel that polarization in the Netherlands is if you compare it to the situation in your home country? And then I would say for you, maybe, Matt, also a bit of your audience country, which is also a bit of the UK, because otherwise we have two Americans. Let's start with Molly.
I mean, clearly, I think polarization here is not nearly as bad as it is in the United States. I mean, I think it's much more civil in a lot of ways. Not to say that there are not problems here and that you do not see this and there's not growing issues with sort of, the populist right and this kinds of things. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, Americans are always good at taking something and doing like the huge version of it. And they've definitely sort of, I think, taken it to the max with this kinds of, these sort of media outlets that are just kind of, essentially propaganda for some sort of, ideology as opposed to maybe propaganda for like the state. But that being said, I mean, you do see it here, although I find it quite interesting to talk about sort of polarization in this country that used to have such polarized media sources, right? Like during this like period of like the Verzaulinge, like the pillarization thing where it was like, I mean, you had Protestants and Catholics and socialists and those were your only options and these are the only choices you got and everybody like watched their own TV and stuff. And I mean, clearly things have changed since then and now it seems to be going in like a slightly different sort of, the new problems have sort of like arisen.
Antoine, if you look at France, it used to have also slightly polarized. There are these socialist newspapers that are very, very one-sided.
Ja, over het perslandschap aan zich, dat klopt dat we misschien wel een grotere polarisatie hebben. Soms heb ik werk ook voor een krant, dat is een soort internationale, hoe heet het? Dat is een krant die neemt over artikels vanuit de buitenlandse pers, die laten vertalen naar het Frans. Dus ik doe het ook voor hen, ik kijk wat enkele mooie artikels vanuit de Nederlandse pers en die vertalen het. En ik heb vaker de vraag gekregen van mijn collega's in Parijs van... Is dat wat is dit voor een krant? Is het meer een linkse krant en een rechtse krant? Maar ik moet toegeven, ik heb het gevoel dat het in Frankrijk een beetje verdwijnt. En dat dit soort polarisatie in Nederland wel... die is wel opmerkelijk. Dus je weet wel dat soms heb ik wel het gevoel, ik moet een bepaald onderwerp vinden over iets over de politiek, geen idee. Nou maar op wat het zou zijn, maar zou ik meer de rechtse kant van de prisme, van het perslandschap, of gewoon van de mening van Nederlanders willen krijgen, dan ga ik ten eerste, Elsevier gaan lezen, of de Telegraaf. In Frankrijk is het nog zo, maar niet op die grootschalige manier. Dus ik heb wel het gevoel dat het in Nederland tenminste qua het pers veel meer gepolariseerd is. Of tenminste verzuild, dat het echt apart is. Je hebt die krant, die andere krant, die een andere soort van meningen vertegenwoordigt. En dat vind je ook, dit soort, ik zou niet zeggen apartheid, maar wel verzuilingssysteem, die merk ik wel op een heel echt, ik merk het wel in Nederland, dus dat is wel echt opmerkelijk voor mij, ja.
En Britta, hoe is dat als je naar Duitsland kijkt?
I think it's...
sorry. What is that like? I'm going to speak French in a second.
Well, my idea is that it's comparable how this polarization, I also saw this in the German media. In a way it's happening here in the Netherlands, but maybe along other lines. I think the Zwarte Piet discussie was really a point where polarization kind of accelerated. And we don't have that in Germany. So that is different, but the way things are drifting apart, I would say is comparable.
The polarization of Bild versus much of the rest of the landscape.
Exactly.
Striking.
I think it's comparable to what the Telegraaf does,
And if you look not only at the US, but also you're the Europe editor for The Economist, so I assume you have a wide helicopter view of other countries. Where does the Netherlands then kind of fall in the European spectrum for you?
one doesn't like this to be too encouraging in a situation that's actually quite serious. I mean, the Netherlands has a really broad diversity of media for the size of the country that it is, and access to also in broadcast media, the system of allowing new public broadcasters to be formed by a subscription system is unique, I think, and it both broadens the type of broadcasting that's available, and it gives people a sense that they have access to the system, one hopes. If you compare that across the European landscape, you know, the countries where you see the worst type of media polarization are countries like Poland or Hungary, where the state broadcaster has fallen prey to a populist takeover and is now simply a propaganda organ, and then the rest of the media landscape has to line up against that. And what you find in those countries is more similar to the American landscape. What happened under Trump in the U.S. was that even outlets which wanted to be neutral could no longer be neutral. And the space for, the New York Times was desperately trying to defend its status as the paper of record. The editor-in-chief said explicitly, we are not part of the resistance, but effectively they were. It was CNN as well. It sort of lost its position in the middle. And that seems very similar to me to the kinds of things that you see going on in Hungary and Poland. The Netherlands doesn't have anything comparable to that at this point. There is a real, there's a big gap between the Telegraaf Elsevier side of the media spectrum, which is still a minority of the media spectrum, even though they're some of the largest titles, and sort of the whole rest of the spectrum.
Do you think if we're looking at, you talk about New York Times and how they're trying to defend their middle position, if you look a bit more at how Dutch media are trying to counter this kind of what is at least felt as a rising polarization, do you feel that the Dutch media feel that they have this role to not polarize, or how do the Dutch media behave? And
I think you can see some of the same anxieties, in particular for broadcasting. You can see some of the same anxieties at the NOS that you see at the BBC, which I should have mentioned at the BBC as well, because it's a perfect case of a state broadcaster which is anxious about its own status. It's anxious that it's perceived as left-wing, urban, cosmopolitan, and so it tiptoes around commentary that would be seen as anti-Johnson. With the NOS, I thought I caught part of the broadcast yesterday about the history of Dutch brand name journalism, it seemed like a terrific show, and it felt like a self-justification to me. I don't know. I don't want to. I don't know if that comes across as belittling or something, but it felt like the network now feels the need to vaunt the triumphs of Dutch broadcast journalism, which has been fantastic for 30 years, and in order to justify its place with the public and to justify the money that it's receiving. I don't know if does that answer the question at all, or?
Well, it's a take on it. Yeah, I think, Jamali, do you have an idea of how the Dutch media are dealing with it and how they could be dealing with it? Looking from my perspective, like I lived in Belgrade for 5 years and covered the Balkans, and there's a lot of the same the things you say in Hungary and Poland, for example, that goes on in the Balkans, and the way that the politicians there are also operating is very similar to some of the populists here. And then I feel that there is kind of a kind of Dutch embarrassment about how to deal with kind of populist politicians who are saying things that maybe if you fact check are not quite right, but you don't want to be ousted as the left-wing media. So then how do you maneuver in that water? And I'm not quite sure, like from my perspective, I wonder if the Dutch media has found their place in how to deal with some of the more extreme bits of the populist movement and the polarization.
I mean, I think some places have. So I listen to as I'm sure everybody here does, right, the Hagzazaka podcast from the NRC, right? And they just did their big, it was 17 hours long podcast about the debate sort of in Parliament, the 2 weeks ago, the APB thing. And they're sort of talking about all the parties, and they kind of really seem to have dedicated, at least, I don't know if they did this deliberately, but they really seem to have dedicated, right, the amount of time discussion on the podcast to appropriate amounts of like how much votes or how big of a share these parties sort of have in parliament and how relevant they are to like the formation discussion, right? Which means that sort of these like right-wing populist parties, you know, the FVD, whatever, like did not get a ton of time because they're not that relevant to this conversation. But if you look at something like the 8 Uur Journal, which my mother-in-law is very annoyed that this broadcast is timed at the same time as, you know, you see every time you see a debate in Parliament, right, there's always quotes from Wilders. And if Baudet has shown up to say something, there's always a quote from Baudet. And you think like, yeah, I mean, they have nothing interesting to contribute to these discussions sometimes. So like, why is there constantly, you know, him and Rutte and maybe someone from the CDA? Like, that's not really representative of a lot of like, the things that are kind of being debated here. And so I do think it's kind of what Matt said, right? That these broadcasters are very concerned about their sort of image as being, you know, left-wing and urban and to whatever. And so they're counterbalancing that by constantly giving screen time to kind of these, yeah, right-wing politicians who don't sort of represent the amount of, you know, opinions and people in this country as the amount of media coverage that they get.
But there's also this dilemma with populists. Yeah. If you invite them to talk shows, you're reproached of giving them too much space. And if you don't invite them, you are leaving them out and not giving them a voice and not giving the public the chance to debunk them in a way. So that's a dilemma that's really hard to be solved. And the German media struggle the same. How much time do you give to the AfD, and where should you just not give them time? I think that's a different discussion where you can't really say the solution is this.
In France, the Front National has been large for many, many years. There have been a lot of several presidential runoffs where it seemed to be a neck-and-neck race between the candidates.
Maybe still the case.
Do you think that the French media have found a way to deal with Front National? Are they giving it equal attention, too much, too little? Could the Dutch media learn something from the way that the French are dealing with it? Or?
Ja, over Frankrijk zou ik niet veel kunnen zeggen, moet ik toegeven. Want mijn gevoel is eigenlijk dat, ja, wat je zegt over het feit dat... Wat Britta ook zei over het feit dat er is dit soort dilemma tussen... misschien hebben we hen te veel ruimte gegeven of als we dat niet doen, dan zijn ze niet blij en doen alsof ze worden niet gehoord. En mijn gevoel is meer dat het ook hier zo in Nederland is, dat je soms het gevoel krijgt, ook als je als gewone journalist, ook als buitenlandse journalist op het Malieveld gaat en je wordt uitgescholden, gewoon als journalist. Dus die mensen weten niet wie je bent. Ze weten zelf niet waar je vandaan komt. Ook niet of je Nederlands bent of Nederlander bent of Duitser. Of, ja. Maar ze bestempelen als slecht vanwege het feit dat je bent een journalist. En in Frankrijk, zoals in Nederland, heb ik soms het gevoel dat mensen die vast in de redactie zitten, ook nieuwsankers, die misschien minder in contact zijn met, of eindredacteurs, die minder in contact zijn met die mensen op het Malieveld, of met die kleine groepje mensen die af en toe in de buurt, op het plein of in de buurt van het torentje willen protesteren. Dat de verbinding is gewoon afgebroken en ja, een vertegenwoordigers zijn heel vaak op tv, maar die mensen hebben wel het gevoel dat ze ongehoord worden. En dat kan zijn dat ze overdrijven voor politieke, ja, gewoon een soort politiek spel van we laten ons stem heel hard horen en dan krijgen we aandacht. Maar tegelijk heb ik ook het gevoel van... dat is ook het geval in Frankrijk, misschien in andere landen, maar ook in Nederland, dat de hoge instanties, ook de overheid en ook soms helaas de journalisten, een beetje te... Ja, de verbinding is gewoon afgebroken en er zijn andere stemmen in dezelfde politieke partij dan die van Wilders of die van Baudet, maar die zijn eigenlijk bijna de enige die men aan het woord laat binnen. Want die gewone mensen die op hun stemmen, we horen die, maar niet op een heel duidelijke manier. En mijn idee is altijd van, als je probeert om die... Ja, gewoon een tegengeluid of een gewoon geluid te stoppen, dan dat werkt hoe heet het, averechts. Dus dat is... en vooral, we moeten de hele samenleving in kennis van de hele samenleving hebben, niet enkel van de ene groep of die andere. Dus als iemand iets vreselijks zegt, dan heeft hij het gezegd, maar men weet tenminste dat die mens denkt het, dat die mens heeft het gezegd en niet het gevoel krijgen dat Nederland bijvoorbeeld een soort perfecte democratie is, waar niemand, weet je, vreselijke dingen zal zeggen of denken. Of, ik bedoel niet dat wat bepaalde groeperingen zeggen vreselijk is, maar ja, dat is maar mijn gevoel, dat we een beetje soms als journalisten ook te veel proberen om bepaalde ideeën in de kast te laten. En dat is niet onze rol, vind ik. Ja.
People have also made the opposite case to me about France specifically, that Marine Le Pen is a television beast and got tremendous amounts of time on France 2 for like many years.
Erover, het verschil is dat is al lang geleden wat ik ga nu vertellen, maar ik kan me nog heel goed herinneren als ik nog op de middelbare school zat. Ik keek naar de tv en ik hoorde ook van mijn hele omgeving van ja, waarom hebben die mensen aan het woord gelaten? En toen waren er nog heel veel media die jarenlang hun best gedaan hebben om die mensen van Marine Le Pen, want ze werden gewoon als duivel bestempeld. Ik laat het aan ik heb geen mening erover, maar ze werden niet aan het woord gelaten voor een heel lange tijd, een heel lange periode. En nu al 10 jaar of iets meer, 15 jaar lang horen we die constant. Maar waarom? Misschien zou men zich de vraag moeten stellen van misschien werden die te lang gewoon gedempt. En nu ontploft het. Dat is ook het probleem, denk ik.
There was here the big discussion that we were keeping it all under at Paars, and that kind of after Pim Fortuyn it kind of exploded, and now we're doing it. But do you think one of the things that Antoine is saying is that there's also a kind of disconnect maybe between the people who are running the Dutch media or that have little or lesser connections to the wider audience?
Well, I think this these stickers that turned up at demonstrations, NOS, fake news, that's a bit the parallel in Germany. You have all of a sudden this Lügenpresse insult came up, which is, I think, even worse than this fake news because it stems from the Third Reich, but this is kind of new, and but it also shows that these people don't watch television anymore in order to learn something, but they see that as their enemy, and this is something new, I think. And I think that's definitely true, and if you look at sociological examinations of who is in the mainstream media, people tend to come from a similar class, and there's a lot of bias inherent in that. On the other hand, the other way of looking at the phenomenon of the development of polarization and of populism is that this is a phenomenon that is generated to some extent by the mechanisms of the media. And the people who have been successful in founding populist parties are people who know what the taboos are in media and go straight there. And that generates a tremendous explosion of attention, and it resonates often with people's body. Like if it didn't resonate with anything in the audience's sense of themselves, that it wouldn't work. But the notion that this is an authentic set of ideas which already existed, which wasn't being heard, I think is only partially true. The other thing that's happening is that a
media machine for generating outrage and a media machine for generating opposition is being expertly manipulated by certain people who are very good at that. And Thierry Baudet is terrific at that, or was. He's sort of losing his touch. But at the beginning of his career...
He's losing a few things.
Yes.
I mean, what you're saying, and this isn't just the media, right? Like, you see that Baudet had this horrible tweet on, was it Holocaust Memorial Day or the memory?
Yeah, when they unveiled the Holocaust memorial
in Amsterdam,
the monument.
And then, of course, you know, Rabiata gets up in Parliament and wants an apology from him. And I think, like, yeah, why are we discussing this on the floor of the Parliament? It was horrible. Everybody knows it's horrible. Like, all you're doing is giving more air to this sort of generated discussion that Baudet is like. I mean, I don't think that, like, a lot of Baudet's constituents, well, maybe some people were, but I don't think, like, general people in the Netherlands were sitting around on the day that this was unveiled and going, like, well, you know, what we're really not talking about here is, like, who else died during the Holocaust? Like, I don't think that people would care about that.
Well, I mean, what he wants to mobilize, which all these people want to mobilize, is he wants to say something which is seen as racist or accused of being racist, but which is just on the line.
Yeah.
And when people see him then being accused of being racist, they identify with the feeling of being accused of being racist, and that splits the political field. And his bet is that more people will end up on his side than the other side. Yeah. It's a really effective mechanism, and often what the response on the opposite fringe is, people who demand the apology, that machine works for them too. Yeah. But in most countries, it's a smaller public that they act, it's a smaller constituency that they win on that side. But for both sides, it's very, it's helpful to generate that kind of noise.
But do you think that we're kind of in a way locked as a media, locked in a kind of dance with these politicians? I remember having a lot of discussions with my Reuters editors at some point. This was when I think before the last elections, or before even the elections before that, where Wilders had 8 seats and so did GroenLinks. And whenever Wilders said something, we were reporting on it. And we were at some point, we're like, we're going to stop reporting as much on this guy. He has 8 seats in Parliament. I'm not reporting on everything that Femke Halsema suggests, even if it's like big things. So why, are we not perpetuating it? Why does the foreign media, also if you look at the amount of attention that they give Dutch politicians, Rutte gets a lot of attention, and Wilders probably gets more attention than Rutte. I think more page time. So, how do you?
Yeah, I think he used to.
Yeah,
and now it's
Yeah, I think at least for the foreign press, the act grows old at some point, and people don't really want to hear that line anymore. I mean, now, I'm about to write a piece about Tomio Okamura, who's the Czech far-right leader, who's interesting mostly because he's half Japanese, but you need a new twist. Otherwise it's just the same story in every country, and
Do you think there's a lessening foreign interest in polarization in the Dutch society? Because for a long time we were all writing these stories like the traditionally tolerant Dutch. Yeah.
Now it's not the traditional. The tradition is gone. It's been 20 years.
Your tradition is over. It's done.
Right. It has to be a man bites dog story, and that's no longer man bites dog. It's dog bites man.
Do you think that works as well for the German paper?
Well, I know that I had to report a lot on Wilders, and I don't report on Baudet anymore. So the interest has really faded.
But do you guys get a lot of interesting coverage about like the anti-corona, the like sort of WAPI kind of stuff? Like, is that a thing? Because that is where I feel like this has shifted towards, right? I mean, like for a long time it was sort of Wilders with like the anti-Islam thing or whatever, and now I feel like we've all forgotten about that, and we have moved on to the sort of like having your corona app checked as fascism kind of discussion. And I mean, do you guys get, like, because this isn't kind of like the reporting coverage that I do, I just sort of wonder if you get a lot of like editors going like, yeah, can you do a story about this protest in Amsterdam on Sunday with the 25,000 people?
Not really, because we have them in Germany as well.
So they're just not interesting. It's just like, this is boring.
Punt aan het begin, er waren momenten waar ik moest wel naar een bepaalde betoging gaan in verband met viruswaarheid of viruswaanzin.
Ja.
Ik heb ook want soms moet ik ook reportages regelen, organiseren voor bijvoorbeeld France 2. Dit is onze Franse nationale televisiezender, de publieke omroep. En Dus toen die hele reilen begonnen zijn, dat was in januari volgens mij, ja?
De avondklokkerellen?
In januari, ja, die reilen. Ik werd gebeld door France 2 en een ploeg vanuit Brussel wilde naar Nederland komen. En ze vroegen, wie is de baas van die bewegingen? En dus ik had contact van tevoren met Willem Engel. En ik weet nog van Twitter dat er waren Nederlandse journalisten die hebben het gezien. Dus die hebben de reportage gekeken van France 2 of iemand heeft het gezien. Hij heeft het gewoon... gewoon doorgestuurd op Twitter. En hij zei, ik had gezegd dat is de leader van de viruswaarheid, of van de, van de anti-maatregelenbeweging. En ze hebben het compleet uitgelachen, die journalisten, die Nederlandse journalisten, want ze dachten, ja, dat is gewoon een gekke, aparte persoon. Maar, hoe was het? 2 weken later, of 1 maand later, wie was in de rechtbank om gewoon alles te willen laten stoppen? Dat was die Willem Engel, die door bepaalde Nederlandse journalisten als gekkie werd beschouwd. Die als gekkie, niet enkel als gekkie, maar als iemand die helemaal geen macht of invloed zou hebben. Dat was niet het geval. En dat is iets dat ik wel in Nederland heb gemerkt, van een beetje bepaalde groepering. Dat is een beetje wat ik bedoelde ook met, met die rechtsextremen of met die populisten. Dat men soms bepaalde groeperingen en bepaalde mensen gewoon neerkijkt, weet je. Een beetje van boven, en wie is dit? En waarom laat je hem aan het woord? Hij is het niet waard. Maar dat is juist die soort mensen die soms in grote groeperingen van de bevolking vertegenwoordigen. Of tenminste, waarvan mensen denken, ja, hij lijkt op mij, hij is precies zo gek als ik. Dus ja, en dat, of misschien niet gek, maar gewoon iemand die lijkt op mij. En dat is wel wat ik voel van als ik soms gesprekken heb met Nederlandse journalisten. Dat het, dat die mensen gewoon niet waard zijn om geïnterviewd te worden, of weet je.
Do you think that's maybe also a verzuilingsthing, where we have this paternalistic idea of that the media is also there to make a kind of selection of who is interesting to talk to and who isn't? And I feel that there's a kind of double thing where on the one hand there is a lot of people like Willem Engel, who is like the weird dance teacher, that we're not going to have him be heard. But then you have the other people of things like Ongehoord Nederland, who get an enormous podium. And then you see all these articles like, they're not listening to me. And it's a front page article in the Telegraaf. And I'm like, you have one on the front page of the main newspaper. Like, I think they're listening. I think you're getting attention.
Well, the other thing that I think you're right about is that people, I mean, you're probably younger than me, but I think people of my generation have difficulty estimating what is going to work on social media.
Yeah.
Social media is, Willem Engel is a very successful social media entrepreneur with, it turns out he's, quite skillful, and it's hard to tell at the beginning when somebody leaps out, for their first foray into the news, how good they're going to be at generating an audience.
But even with that, I mean, even when he was obviously, he won that avondklokkerellen court case, I think Anna Halligan from the BBC did something about these anti-vaxxers and the kind of QAnon theories that came up in the Netherlands. And she interviewed Willem Engel, and on Twitter, almost the entire Dutch media kind of also lambasted her for interviewing him as a serious person next to all the other people. Really as kind of, how could you talk to this person as a credible source?
Credible, like that's that balance of credible in what sense? Someone who has a really big audience, he is credible in that sense, in terms of the information that he's going to spread in the interview that you do with him. That's the issue. Do you want to get a platform?
So I remember this interview, and I think in defense of that interview, I thought she framed it fairly well and sort of like juxtapositioning, thank you, like sort of his thoughts on things versus like how like unmoored from reality his way of thinking was, right? Like I actually thought she did quite good with this interview, sort of like, you know, showcasing the facts that like he thinks things that are like totally unfounded in like realistic life, right? And I remember the sort of backlash that she got against that, and some of that I think is like the whole like, well, we can sort of, you know, we don't want somebody else airing our dirty laundry. It's like fine when we're sort of doing this as like Dutch people and Dutch journalists. This is like a Dutch problem, but you are like a foreigner who's now doing it. I mean, I think that's like
dat is precies mijn gevoel. Dat is wat ik vertelde over die krant waarvoor ik werk, die artikels overneemt van andere van buitenlandse kranten. Er is, onlangs heb ik een mooi artikel, en dat was in het Parool, gezien over de cannabisteelt en vooral een soort high-tech cannabisteelt. En iedereen in Nederland heeft het kunnen lezen. Wat die krant voor wie ik werk doe, is, ze bellen dus ik zeg, er is een mooi artikel, ze kijken of het lijkt goed te zijn of niet. En dan, als ze er belangstelling in hebben, ze bellen de krant en zeggen, we zouden gewoon de rechten willen kopen om het artikel te overnemen in het Frans te laten vertellen. En de antwoord van het Parool was, nee, het gaat om één persoon en ze wilden het gewoon niet internationaliseren. Maar waarom? En die vraag stel ik me constant. Wat is het probleem? Jullie zijn een krant en zelfs in de overheidsinstantie zou het ook op die manier moeten denken. Dat is belangrijk dat het buitenland weet wat in Nederland gebeurt. Vooral, die hebben het geschreven, dus schamen ze zich erover. En ik ga een korte tweede voorbeeld geven, maar mijn idee is ook van, wat sommige Nederlanders, wat mij hier opvalt in Nederland soms, ik wil niet veralgemenen en zeggen dat Nederland een slecht land is, dat is helemaal niet het geval. Maar wat mij soms opvalt is dat men vergeet dat Nederland een lid is van de Europese Unie. En dat kan zijn dat, ik vind het ook vreselijk als ze zouden een interview weigeren aan een Amerikaanse krant of televisieomroep, maar soms, mij werd nog enkele maanden geleden door iemand van het RIVM gezegd dat, weet je, de Frans-Duitse tv, we worden niet veel wijzer van. En zoiets, dat komt zo hard aan bij mij, want Frankrijk is een buurland, Duitsland is een buurland. En ik weet dat dat is al moeilijk voor mij om de belangstelling van het Franstalig publiek te krijgen over Nederland, maar te trekken naar Nederland. Maar dat is belangrijk dat het Europese publiek wordt geïnformeerd over wat gebeurt in al die landen. En mijn korte tweede voorbeeld was, enkele jaar geleden, ik moest voor France 2 een interview regelen met een populaire zanger in Nederland. Dus we moesten een reportage maken over een populaire zanger. Dat was in een serie, in het kader van een mooie serie voor de Franse televisieomroep, de publieke omroep, over populaire zangers in Europa, in heel Europa, een beetje zoals Johnny Hallyday in Frankrijk zou zijn. En ik zei, dan kunnen we misschien een mooie reportage over Jan Smit maken. En ik heb Jan Smit gebeld. Ik heb niet Jan Smit direct, maar ik heb gewoon de persvoorlichter of iemand die met hem werkte gebeld of ook gemaild. En tenslotte, nee, dat ging niet. Want wat is de belangstelling? We hebben... is het in ons belang? Wat is ons belang? Dat is wat ik wakker hier hoor. En daarna heb ik geprobeerd om met, hoe heet hij, de zoon van André Hazes Jr. Ja? En dat was hetzelfde. En iemand zei tegen mij, ja, maar er zijn geen... tussen ons, er zijn helemaal geen mensen die zullen de muziek van Jan Smit of van André Hazes Jr. in Frankrijk kopen. Maar toen zei ik, ja, er is een gedeelte van Frankrijk, bijvoorbeeld in het oosten, ze zijn fan van Duitsstalige muziek. En vooral, dus het is mij niet gelukt om die ervan te overtuigen. We hebben niets over Nederlandse muziek gedaan. En in plaats daarvan was er een leuke Griekse zanger op tv. die misschien wel zijn muziek in Frankrijk nu verkoopt. En dat is het verschil.
And Britta, you work for German television. German is the biggest neighbor of the Netherlands. Do you get the same thing? Does the Dutch media, are they interested in being on German television? Do they have an interest in maintaining a relationship with the Germans?
Oh, I think it depends, like always. Well, as I said, ministries very often are, I don't know if they're afraid, but they prefer not to be on German television very often. But I do a lot of pieces on people who have invented stuff, people who have products, you know, the water management. And these people really are a bit flattered when they appear on German television, or flattered is maybe too much, but they think it's a nice idea to be on German television. So it's really double.
Jan Smit might have said yes to you.
Sorry?
Jan Smit might have said yes to you.
Yeah, the style of the music also works better.
Yeah, but I mean, he certainly would have said yes to me, not that I would have asked, because I feel like I have the opposite problem from you two, which is like people are like weirdly obsessed with getting stuff into English language media. I feel like I sometimes will get phone calls from people, and I'm like, you shouldn't know who I am. Like, I'm not that important, and I do a very sort of like niche thing. And they're sort of like, yeah, but you write in English, and I'm like, I mean, that's not okay. This is not, I don't understand. I'm going to direct it to you guys next time.
And does it work? You get a lot of flack from what you call Luxembourg flag Twitter.
Oh God, yes.
Because you mentioned this before, you touched on like whenever you say something negative about the Dutch, you get a lot of flack because we like to, if we have problems, like to say it about ourselves, but other people can't bash the Netherlands.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I don't know, to a degree that is like sort of a universal thing, right? Like I can make fun of my younger brother, but like, I'll come for you if you make fun of my younger brother sort of situation. But yeah, I mean, Luxembourg flag Twitter is a nightmare to deal with, and I highly recommend you don't end up on the radar.
But does that cover all international issues that might have to do with Lux attacks?
No, it has nothing to do with Luxembourg. It's because the flags are very similar, and people who are not very smart.
Luxembourg flag Twitter is the like Baudet Forum voor Democratie, Ongehoord Nederland people who don't. I think Luxembourg flag is probably before the Dutch flag or something.
I think so. It's just one of these things, right?
Slightly
different, right? But yeah, I mean, they're the ones, and sort of going back to this discussion about like kind of the populist far right, right? Like, I mean, I never think twice about sort of saying something dumb on Twitter about like sort of like left-leaning part. It never crosses my mind to kind of poke fun at kind of left-leaning stuff. And every time I've got a joke that's sort of like poking fun at the right-leaning guys, I sort of like look at my calendar and I'm like, yeah, how busy am I going to be today if this kind of blows up in the wrong circle? And you sort of have to spend the day dealing with like, and doing an aangifte with the police because people are sending you death threats. I mean, this is kind of like the difference in these sort of like extreme situations. I mean, I'm not old enough to sort of know what journalism was like before social media was a thing. So like for me, this is sort of like normal existence, right? But like, yeah, I mean, that's definitely been an aspect that you sort of see where people are like, well, how much do you kind of want to be participating in this online discourse? And yeah, I mean, sometimes Luxembourg flag Twitter, these people, they just get mad at the most like absurd stump hot pizza things.
But do they, I mean, are they going after you for things that you've written in pieces in print or just for things you say on Twitter?
It's almost always things that I say on Twitter. Once in a while, it's stuff that I've written. Like, I have written a couple of times about these, like, court cases with Willem Engel and stuff, and then you can sort of, like, it gets published. Clearly, people have, like, sort of, like, a Google News alerts out for these kinds of things, and then they track you down, and they, like, send you weird emails and messages. And, it's one of these things where it's, like, a bit of a roll of the dice, like, kind of what blows up online and, like, what doesn't. And, like, sometimes, like, you just are unlucky, and, like, you are, like, the thing that they, want to come after. But, yeah, I mean, my worst experiences online sort of have all had to do with Corona, right? That there's just been something about Corona that's just, like, ratcheted this up to going from, like, yeah, whatever. I mean, if people want to send me messages on Twitter and be like, you know, you're ugly and you're like stupid and you should go back to America or whatever, like, I mean, yeah, you're going to have to try a little harder to get me to be upset.
But so you don't think that it affects the kinds of things that you write at all?
Oh, no, it makes me think about stuff. I mean, I had a really ugly dust-up with some of these guys, like, or girls, I mean, who knows, just before Christmas, and I really scaled back sort of my, like, willingness to kind of cover, like, sort of things that had to do with, like, Corona stuff. That I was just like, yeah, I mean, life is too short for me to have to be dealing 3 days before Christmas, being at the police station, sort of being like, yeah, these guys are sending me death threats and my address. Like, they found all of this information. And so you think, like, yeah, I mean, I'm not that interested in dealing with this.
Do you have any of that, or is The Economist just not so...
We don't have bylines. I seem not to be sufficiently good at annoying people online to get enough response. So I don't know. I mean, when you were reporting when you talk about polarization, I feel like the experience of reporting from former Yugoslavia must be like
It's different because I was always working for foreign media there, so it's not as bad as when you're working for the media in that country. But I do remember writing something about some clashes at the border with Kosovo, and then I think I quoted somebody, a Serbian police chief, who said that so many people were injured and something, and there was like 2 days later, there was a big article in one of the Serbian tabloids that said, basically the headline was, "We Serbs are always the bad guys," says French press agency.
right.
And I was like, and they were like, the French press agency, which has its offices in our, like, they didn't say the address, but it's in a square, so it's pretty obvious. So after that, we were like, maybe not as much. And the media there is much more, I guess, willing also to basically attack other journalists and print things that we wouldn't print, like. There's just an entirely different, even with the Telegraaf doing some of the things they do, it's not near anywhere what a Serbian tabloid would do, or what even like probably the British tabloids would say and do. So we all think like this is kind of maybe becoming more polarizing, but it's a world away from what Balkan media does. I have a friend who's a correspondent in Kosovo, and she was going to some press conference with Serbian Prime Minister Vučić, and she tweeted a photo with somebody who was a colleague of her who had mistakenly put some filter on Vučić while he was filming the press conference, the dog ear filter.
Like cat lawyer, did he get stuck?
No, well, yeah. So no, it was not the journalist, but the journalist had it on, so it looked like Vučić, the Serbian prime minister, had the dog ears. And then the article in like lots of Serbian newspapers the day after was like, Kosovo journalist makes Serbian prime minister look like a dog or whatever, and she got completely kind of canceled by Serbian Twitter and everything. And this is one of the few, in a way, allies that or this is a Kosovo journalist that speaks Albanian and Serbian and lives in both countries, and she just got completely blasted just for some tweet of him with the dog filter, because they pretend that it's all extremely serious. And I think that we're not at that level at all in the Netherlands, but I also feel that Dutch media have a hard time. On the one hand, I agree with Antoine that like you shouldn't bite at you shouldn't censor what you report. But on the other hand, there is that kind of way that the Dutch media kind of cannot resist but comment on whatever Baudet is saying on a day where you're just like, why?
Ja, die commentaarcultuur bedoel je?
Yeah. Or then we all have to get all sides all the time, where like if one side is like science and the other side is insanity, then maybe like
salsa instructors.
Should we not like maybe we should look at like some of the commentators they get also in the anti-vax debate. Are they always, if you look at the percentages of people here who are vaccinated for whatever reason, but if you look at the coverage of who we're talking to about this debate, you know, it's part of journalism that you like the extreme. Like, it's not very interesting to have somebody who's like, well, yes, it was quite quick, the development of the vaccine, but I believe in science, so I'll do it, even though I have some hesitations. That's not a very interesting article. But
I mean, I feel like this happens everywhere, so it's not necessarily a criticism of like Dutch media, but what happens when you sort of focus on these extremists is that you kind of miss the discussion about, that's like the valid conversations about this. So today, I don't remember which NRC, I think it was an NRC columnist that was talking about her sort of, I don't know if it was full-throated opposition, but sort of hesitancy about having to check the QR codes thing. And she had some like good points that she was kind of like making on Twitter, right, about this kinds of stuff. And I feel like, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I necessarily agree with her, but this seems like a well-reasoned, well-thought-out, like, I'm interested in reading this column. Like, I want to hear more from this. And instead, what you get on, you know, on these shows are all these kind of like totally like off the wall sort of people who are just saying things that don't make any sense and are kind of unfounded and unresearched. And it's like, yeah, we're giving all the oxygen to like this person instead of, you know, people who have like valid concerns. I think that there were really interesting, valid legal issues about like the curfew and like this kinds of stuff when it came up. And it was really hard to find people who like were sort of had, you know, kind of like normal, not normal necessarily, but sort of like well-reasoned, well-argued opinions about this. It was mostly people who were just like, well, this is fascism, and like the government is taking over, and like, I don't know, whatever, blah, 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 instead of it being like, wow, you know, there's like real concerns about the legality of like this kinds of stuff.
But yeah, I mean, if you talk about polarization in the media and the way that it functions, what I feel like a lot of what's happening there is that we in the mainstream media are also dependent on the equivalent of clicks. Like, we're looking for eyeballs and we're looking for time. And what happens in these kinds of disputes is that in order to generate rapid reactions to get people's eyeballs, you quickly sort people into two camps. Yeah. And those camps are much more, you're much more likely to get a rapid eyeball response and consistent viewership once you've sorted people into camps, then you know how to appeal to them, you know what the market is. And with those kinds of arguments, the complicated questions about whether it's legitimate or not to institute certain maatregelen that doesn't help you sort people into camps, and it doesn't give you an immediate response. People aren't going to click on that rapidly when you send out the social media promotion for your article.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, it feels like it's a natural polarizing system.
And that's now, writing is getting more naturally polarized because of the clicks, but that's something that's kind of always been that way in television, because you have very little space to give the message. But do you find, Britta, you work mainly for television, and Antoine as well for Arte, do you find that it's getting also more polarized in the way you report on TV, that it has to be even more?
Well, that's... In terms of Corona, I think that was difficult, because I think every country was staring at their own navel. And when I did reporting on Corona in the Netherlands, it was when it was really very different from Germany, which was in the time that in Germany everybody was masked, was specialized masked, and didn't go out much, and that wasn't happening here at all. So I interviewed a lot of German tourists coming here and saying, oh, they're so relaxed here. And then second question would be, yeah, have you looked at the numbers, you know? And they weren't aware of them, or not aware, or they didn't find it so difficult, which was really weird, but that's not really representative for reporting in polarized times. So I cannot really tell you what my answer would be.
Ja, voor mij die polarisatie in mijn eigen werk, dat is mij, het bestond mij erin dat er was een bepaald moment, en dat is nog steeds het geval vandaag, vooral, dat is al voor de coronacrisis begonnen, maar kort voor. Ik heb soms het gevoel dat er is een grote polarisatie hier in Nederland, bijvoorbeeld rondom de Zuid-Europese landen, Frankrijk inclusief, wat voor mij zich altijd graag aanvoelt, want ik kom uit een stad in Frankrijk die noordelijker is dan Maastricht en Sittard. Maar ja, we zijn blijkbaar een zuidelijke land en dat horen we heel vaak hier in Nederland door Nederlandse politici, ook door de gewone burgers. En er was een moment ook kort voor de coronacrisis, dat begon aan met... Daarom is het voor ons mij belangrijk, ook als buitenlandse media, vooral als Franstalige media, om het te hebben over mensen als Baudet of Wilders. Want ook mensen als Hoekstra, vandaar was ook zijn dag. Maar ja, want er was een tijd, niemand wist het in Frankrijk. Dat was voor mij heel moeilijk om Franstalige Franse collega's, ook van andere Franstalige landen, ervan te overtuigen. Er is iets hier aan de hand in Nederland met jullie, met Fransen, met Italianen, met Spanjaarden, met Portugezen. Er wordt hier in Nederland heel slecht gesproken over ons. En het gaat om geld, maar het gaat ook om andere dingen. Ook hoe Hoekstra begonnen was om zijn eigen ANZA-liga met andere Noordische landen te vormen. Dat is ook iets dat voor ons als Fransen bijvoorbeeld, of Franstalig publiek, zorgwekkend is, denk ik. En dat was heel moeilijk voor mij om tegen mijn collega's ervan te overtuigen. Ja, zo vandaar werd iets heel vreselijk gezegd, of tenminste op een vreselijke manier, of harde manier over de Franse overheid, of over Fransen, Italianen. En nu merk ik dat het doorgegaan is, dat is binnengedrongen een beetje bij mijn collega's. Maar weet je, er was een keer, Baudet zei iets over, er was een probleem met de pulsvisserij. Dus er is een grote ruzie al jarenlang aan de gang tussen Franse vissers en Nederlandse vissers over, hoe heet het, die
pulsvisserij.
En Baudet zei iets in een soort campagneclip. Hij was op het plein, er waren vissers in de achtergrond, die waren aan het betogen. Die waren heel echt boos, kwaad. En hij zei, ja, dit alles, dat is de schuld van Zuid-Europa, Zuid-Europese landen, die kunnen met ons niet concurreren. En dat was eigenlijk in dit kader niet Europese landen, Zuid-Europese landen aan zich. Dat waren heel specifiek Franse vissers die een ruzie met hen hadden. En er was een ander moment, dus met Hoekstra was het ook zo, ook met Rutte toen, ik weet niet of jullie dat nog in jullie achterhoofd hebben, maar er was Rutte was aan het lopen, er was iemand die, hoe heet het, in vuilnis...
Ja,
de
vuilnisman, geen cent meer naar de...
Geen geld aan Italië en Spanje. En toen, ja, ik vond het opmerkelijk dat het tenslotte eindelijk binnendrong naar Italië en Spanje. Dat was op de Spaanse en op de Italiaanse tv. Maar sinds ik hier al gekomen ben, ik hoor het constant. Dus, en dat is iets dat bijvoorbeeld Fransen, maar ook kan ik me voorstellen andere Zuid-Europese mensen, niet weten hoe de relatie hier is. En de polarisatie is intern. Dat is mijn gevoel. Dat is het probleem met niet willen internationaliseren wat in Nederland gezegd wordt. Dus dat is ook wat ik probeer te doen. Want mijn gevoel is, als die polarisatie hier, dus dit anti-Zuid-Europa gevoel gewoon intern blijft, dan is er geen debat mogelijk. Fransen, Spanjaarden, Italianen of Portugezen kunnen niet tegen Nederlanders zeggen... soms zijn ze aan het ruzien nu, maar ze kunnen ook zeggen van... Nee, jullie overdrijven een beetje. Of misschien moeten we inderdaad inspanningen doen om een beetje een balans te vinden tussen wat jullie willen of wat jullie doen en wat wij doen. Maar als elke land, vooral als Nederland, zijn interne gesprek over Zuid-Europa hier voert zonder in debat te gaan met andere Zuid-Europese landen, ja, ik vind dat het tot een bepaalde polarisatie voert en dat het wel best zorgwekkend is. Ja.
I'm going to try and round up a bit, so we'll also give a chance to people in the audience to ask questions. But you, Antoine, already touched upon it a bit. How do we see the future of which way the Netherlands is going with that polarization? You said if they keep it this way internal, we will see more and more conflict with other, maybe outside world, southern countries. Britta, do you have an idea of where the future is if the Netherlands keeps on this track in polarization terms, if it gets more polarized or?
Well, I think this European example is a very good one because this Vreckige Vier discussion that was quite big in European things, but it was used really for here, for the Netherlands. And I think that's a really weird discrepancy because, yes, Rutte has really tried to be a Vreckige Vier, but in the end, he signed on every European treaty there is. Yeah. So in reality, not so much was really so different from the main cause. So I just hope that this is kind of demasked in a way, that it's just a game and it's not working. Or I don't think polarization is working. Definitely not with the main problems we're facing in all of Europe and the whole world, probably. And I just hope that the Dutch will be smart enough to see that it's a street that is not ending well.
Matt, do you think the Dutch will wise up and see that?
I don't think people wise up in general. That's not a thing that happens in the world. But I think it's actually really interesting to take this. If you talk about polarization both in a domestic context and an international context, what's happening in both situations is the Dutch internal political system is extremely complicated. People who polarize are people who are looking to create campaign slogans in an extremely complicated field, which are easily understandable to voters, and they face a difficult situation because of the complexity of the political system in mobilizing voters. So you want to create very visible and easily explainable contradictions that can get people up out of their seats to do something. And that's very dangerous in an internal context. In the European context, the same sort of thing is going on. It's an incredibly complicated system. Nobody understands how things emerge out of the European Union. It's much easier to explain it as, well, it's the Northerners for the Southerners, or it's the, it's a way of explaining easily to the European public, which is inaccurate but can mobilize some sentiment, and that's what politicians need to do. In general, I find the Netherlands comparatively an encouraging example if you compare it to states like the United States or Britain that are really bipolar states with two big parties. You do a better job here of trying to keep things complicated and trying to explain complicated stories, and hopefully that aspect of the Dutch character will win out.
Molly, what's your idea for the future of this?
I think I will take an optimistic outlook, and I'm going to go back to Britta's example of the Zwarte Piet debate, because when I first moved here 10 years ago, right, this was really like, I live in Delft, like you would walk out of your house on the day that Sinterklaas arrived and like every kid is in full blackface. And 10 years on now, you hardly see any of that. People who I know who are deeply invested in this as like this is a Dutch tradition have way mellowed. Like, we used to not have this conversation with my, Dutch partner's parents, and now it's like sort of fine. They've kind of chilled out on this a bit, and I hope that whatever it is kind of about that sort of situation, you can kind of take to maybe these like Corona situations where people sort of realize that like hanging on with your fingernails to these sort of like weird, absurd beliefs is not great, and that you can sort of find compromise and there can be kind of middle ground and people can kind of, relax, and that we can sort of take these traditions and turn them into something that's like much more sort of palatable and that like make, mostly people happy. And I'm gonna, I think, hope that that is like sort of the example that you can sort of see going forward, that like there is some capacity to kind of de-anger and sort of entrench some of this stuff in a way that maybe we will see more positive moves in the future.
Antoine, are you an optimist or a pessimist? where you see the kind of the future going with polarization in the Netherlands? Will it?
Er is een punt waar ik denk van dat het echt problematisch wordt hier in Nederland. Want dat is erger nog in andere landen. In Frankrijk is het veel erger. Maar die polarisatie, wat we hebben eerder gezegd over, weet je ook, over de pers, over de journalisten, die worden als een soort, soms als, gewoon als slecht bestempeld. Ze zijn van de slechte kant. En ja, nu merken we al 1 jaar of 2 jaar of iets meer dat er is steeds meer geweld tegenover journalisten, ook in Nederland. Je hebt, dat merk ik zelf als ik nu op het Malieveld ben. Dat is veel erger geworden binnen de 2 laatste jaren. Aan het begin vond ik het... Ik ben aangekomen in Nederland. Ik dacht van... dat is rustiger als in Frankrijk. En dat was het gevaar. Want hier in Nederland heb ik in het algemeen ook een soort veiligheidsgevoel. Niet enkel in mijn werk, maar in het algemeen. Je bent niet bang om dat je hebt iets een beetje duur in je hand en dat wordt gestolen. Of je fiets wordt soms gestolen hier. Maar weet je, er is een veiligheidsgevoel. En daarom is Nederland ook qua persvrijheid heel hoog in de toprank, in de wereldranking, heel hoog. Maar wat ik nu vrees is dat het anders wordt. En het gaat om die polarisatie. Dus ook mensen die zien in journalisten, in de media in het algemeen bijna de duivel. En dus die worden gewelddadiger. Maar je hebt ook de overheidsinstanties die soms tegenover ons heel veel wantrouwen laten zien. En dat het steeds moeilijker wordt om toegang te krijgen tot een gewone interview. Want ze hebben een soort transparantieplicht. Die worden ook gefinancierd met publieke, dus met belastingsgeld. Dus mijn idee is dat het gevaar qua die polarisatie is dat Nederland over enkele jaren niet meer een model wordt. Want in Frankrijk bijvoorbeeld geldt Nederland als een belangrijke model. En soms ik hoor veel positieve dingen over Nederland constant van Franse collega's of Fransen in het algemeen. Maar wat ze niet zien is dat Nederland aan het verslechteren is, bijvoorbeeld vanwege die polarisatie. En ik kan me niet voorstellen dat Nederland over 1 jaar, 2, 3 jaar nog zo hoog bijvoorbeeld in de ranking persvrijheid blijft. Want het verschil die ik eerder merkte tussen Frankrijk en Nederland was hoog. Dus Frankrijk is op de 34e plaats van de wereldranking. Dat is schandalig eigenlijk. Maar ik bedoel dat Frankrijk zo laag is, want er is veel geweld in Frankrijk, bij betogingen in het algemeen. Maar Nederland is volgens mij geen model meer. Ik ga af en toe naar Denemarken, Zweden voor mijn werk en ik merk hoe makkelijk het soms is om een gewone interview te krijgen. Die vraag van wat is onze belangstelling, die krijg ik niet te horen. Of hoeveel kijkers hebben jullie, van welke land komen jullie? En die krijg ik niet in Denemarken of in Zweden ook niet. Dus mijn gevoel is dat ik kan me voorstellen dat deze ranking, dat Nederland zijn 5e plaats over 1 jaar verliest. Eerder waren ze op de 2e of 3e plek. Nu, ze zijn en dat is iets wat de overheid volgens mij zou moeten aanpakken. Want als Nederland een slechte reputatie heeft, dan profiteert niemand ervan in Nederland. Dat is goed als Nederland een model blijft. Niet enkel voor Nederland, maar ook voor andere landen die een model nodig hebben om beter te worden. Yeah.
I think one of the things that we can show where the Netherlands has kind of, I guess, dropped in safety is that after the avondklokkerellen, I immediately was sent by Reuters on a hostile environment course, which I've never ever had to do in the Netherlands before, because the Netherlands is not considered to be a place, a standplaats where you have to have hostile environment training. But I got one after that, so. We're going to open up a bit for questions in the audience. Does somebody want to have a question or a remark? I guess raise your hand and we'll have a microphone come to you for the TV. Helmut? Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Helmut Hetzel. I'm a former president of the Foreign Press Association in the Netherlands. And I would put forward a very general question to my dear colleagues here at the table. I had the honor to meet the former US President Bill Clinton here in the Netherlands twice. Once as an acting president of the United States and once privately. And I have asked Mr. Bill Clinton, what do you, Mr. President, think about the Netherlands? And Bill Clinton answered to me, very typical, in his typical style, in a one-liner. He thought a little bit and then he answered. Small country, big footprint. My question to you, my colleagues, what is your opinion, your description, very shortly, please, about the Netherlands?
I probably am not the right person to answer this because I am Dutch. But my very, what I find always is that there is a kind of, on the one hand, there's a lot of foreign interest in such a small country. And we have a lot of things that are interesting internationally and seen as very socially forward and as an experimental place. On the other hand, I also find it very odd always that they always lump it together, where you have to say something like we used to have to put a line in our stories, which was like the Netherlands, who are known for gay marriage, legal prostitution, and euthanasia. And I had, at that point, I had a bureau chief from AFP who was gay, who was like, why am I always lumped together with the prostitutes and the euthanasia? Like, why is this apparently a thing? But so I think it can be interesting. But I think the Dutch also have a very dual idea about it. On the one hand, they're very like, we are super important. And on the other hand, whenever we report on something, then the whole Dutch media is like, foreign media reported on us. Now we're going to have like a roundup article to say like, the Dutch press agency Reuters send a snap when Peter R. de Vries died. Yes, like you have an assassination in the street of a major crime reporter. We would also snap that if that happened in Cyprus. Yeah. This is not such a big deal, guys.
Actually, going back to your very first question about things that you find weird, the like weird newspaper roundups, especially coming from the US, who like really does not care about anybody else in the world. And you sort of have these weird newspaper roundups where sometimes they're like, yes, and Reuters reported this, and we also saw this on French television and German television about some event. And I'm like, why are you doing this in the newspaper? I don't understand.
Well, going back to Helmut's question, what do you think about the Netherlands? Can you come up with a Bill Clinton-like one-liner?
One. Reasonable people, terrible food.
En cue the Twitter-storm. Antoine.
Ja, ik zou zeggen, tegelijk open op de wereld, maar tegelijk wel best gesloten maatschappij op buitenlandse Europeanen, op wat gebeurt in Europa, in de buurlanden. Dat is mijn gevoel. Dus open in het algemeen en tegelijk soms best gesloten. Dus ik krijg een dubieus gevoel erbij van, ja.
Well, from a German point of view, it's very often Germans think they know the Netherlands because, well, it's the neighboring country. They understand a few words of Dutch, so it's almost like a province of Germany. But yeah, don't be mistaken. It's very, very different from the German mentality.
Matt, what can you say that you can get away with your Dutch wife?
Yeah, right. I mean, there's nothing that I could say that would get me in trouble with her, actually, in either positive or negative sense. But I don't think one can do that, actually. The forward summary. I think Bill Clinton was being very kind, and he probably says that about every small country that he goes to. I think this is not entirely true. So just as the direction that I would go in a summary is to say the Netherlands is a country that has a tendency to go to sleep and was on the sleepy side of its character and was shaken awake in World War II, stayed awake through the 1990s, and has been lulling itself to sleep again for the last 20 years, and it shouldn't do that.
I see somebody over there dying to correct Molly about the food, possibly.
Bring it on.
He's going to start about that we have Indonesian food. No, I'm joking.
Not problem, problem's okay.
Hello, my name is Tjeerd de Boer from the Institute of Sound Vision here in The Hague. I'd like to get back to an issue you touched right at the beginning of the conversation about the habit in the Netherlands of people want to read back their interviews, their articles, or reviewing a proposed interview. And I have two questions about it. One, why do you think Dutch journalism, Dutch journalists accept this at all in the first place? And the second question is, do you think it makes Dutch media, Dutch journalism more vulnerable for being accused of, being part of the powers that be?
Well, we had a discussion about this before, and one of the things that Dutch journalists told me was, or somebody who used to be a voorlichter told me, was like, they send it to us so they don't get trouble afterwards, but they get the trouble before. And I think also, I feel that there is in Dutch, journalists are really kind of upset when politicians lie to them in interviews or kind of fudge the truth, where I think a lot of foreign journalists more expect politicians to be less than truthful. I wonder sometimes not if at least for the parliamentary press, that relationship here is very close. And I wonder how Molly and Matt and Britta and Antoine would look at it. But that's one of the things I think, that it is very not old boys network, but they know each other very well. And the fact also that half of the spokespeople for Dutch ministries used to be A&P journalists is, or not, maybe half is an exaggeration, but a lot. And that here it's a very regular thing for a journalist to kind of become a woordvoerder. And it's not quite felt as much as going to the dark side as I think it is in other countries, but I might be wrong. So I defer to my...
No, that really astonished me a lot. When you read this Joris Luijendijk book, where he kind of describes this carousel almost, from woordvoerder to journalist to lobbyist to whatever.
Politician.
That's really a no-go, or at least in my generation of journalists in Germany, it's a no-go. You just never become or you do this at the very end of your career if you need to earn some more money. But really, you don't switch back and forth and all this. And it's a very small world, you know. They all know each other, so maybe it's harder to deny favors or to... You know, you say, well, it's not so much harm will be done if my interview is read again because, well, I was truthful. Maybe it's just that you give and take among friends more than, in bigger populations like in Germany, the competition is just harder. You would be dead if you did such a thing. And yeah, that doesn't happen here.
Ja, dat is hetzelfde in Frankrijk, denk ik. Ik heb tenminste altijd gehoord van, ga je naar de communicatie, dan is het gedaan. Er zijn mensen die dat lukt hen om terug te komen, maar dat is bijzonder moeilijk, heb ik altijd gehoord. Maar er was iets met deze manier, want soms heb ik precies hetzelfde gedacht van, is het, hoe heet het... De Nederlandse journalisten die eraan schuldig zijn, die mede schuldig zijn om... want soms, ik maak een reportage en ik word tot bijzonder tot rare situaties geconfronteerd. En dan denk ik van, maar wie heeft dit überhaupt mogelijk gemaakt? En de laatste keer nog, ik moest een reportage over de Bijbelgordel, de vaccinatiegraad in de Bijbelgordel doen. Er was een heel vriendelijke, aardige dominee van een protestantse kerk. Dat was in de buurt van, in de Bijbelgordel. En hij zei, jullie kunnen komen filmen op zondag tijdens de godsdienst. Maar alsjeblieft, de mensen die er in de kerk zijn, dus de kerkgangers, alsjeblieft niet filmen. En dan, elke keer dat ik zoiets hoor, dat gebeurt heel vaak. Ik ga terug in de auto met de cameraman en ik moet bijna huilen. Want wat hebben we dan gefilmd? Dat was zo... hij zei, jullie mogen de mensen filmen, maar niet hun gezichten. Dus dat was een beetje zoals deze deze beeldenstorm. We hebben aan het beeld op de Frans-Duitse tv, dat was op de Frans-Duitse tv, we hebben een kerk gefilmd met een mooie godsdienst, dat was heel mooi, maar zonder hoofden. Dus de mensen hadden geen hoofden. We hebben gewoon de lichamen. En mijn collega's hebben me gebeld en gezegd, wat is dit, Antonia? Ik zei, ja, ik zit in Nederland. en weet u, maar het probleem is, Nederlandse journalisten, misschien anderen en persvoorlichters, heel veel mensen hier denken dat het, dat mag. Dat kan gewoon het werk van journalisten beperken. Maar de reputatie schade in het buitenland... Misschien zou iemand hier in Nederland erover moeten denken. Wat is het imago die men uitzendt naar het buitenland als zoiets gebeurt? Want soms, voor de grap zeg ik, zijn we hier in Noord-Korea. Dus weet je, en dat is niet het gevaar, gelukkig. Maar dat zou mooi zijn als zoiets nooit gebeurt. Want er is minder geweld dan in andere landen. Maar wel, zoiets is een rare gewoonte, vind ik. Ja.
I think it's a really interesting question because if you think about the way that those kinds of agreements are made in political reporting in other countries, there's a tremendous amount of tacit agreement that you're going to say nice things about people. If you read through insider reporting on any American presidential administration, you can tell who the sources were because they're not attacked in the article. And it's just obvious that this person has traded access for favorable coverage. There's no other way to do it. And it makes it more explicit in the Netherlands if people are saying, can I please see the reporting afterwards? But it's not necessarily a completely different... I mean, it's a struggle that has to go on every place between journalists and what you're reporting on. It's possible that you get a very inside baseball, as we call it, tone sometimes in political reporting here, where things are being taken as scandals, which it's often very hard to explain to a non-Dutch person why this is considered scandal. You know, many of the things that have brought down governments and ministers recently, like the Bonetjes affair and things like that, it's just it doesn't classify as a scandal in an outsider terms. And sometimes I think that it's about that issue of trust, assumptions of trust between reporters and people on the inside of the game that are there's a much stronger need for an assumption of trust between people here than in other countries. But I don't know. It happens every place, so yeah.
What do you think, Molly?
I think the Bonetjes affair is the best Dutch scandal.
Yeah, it was amazing.
It's so great. I love explaining this to people. I mean, I coming from this sort of American press tradition, I think it's weird that they ask ahead of time. I think it creates these weird...
Didn't you send me a WhatsApp and she told me, what is that formula you always put in your emails when you have to interview somebody? And it's true, like I have a copy-paste for Reuters. I have a copy-paste paragraph that says, Reuters does not allow me, because actually it is in the Reuters statutes that you cannot show your story before publication. So I say, Reuters doesn't allow me to show you the entire article before publication. I can send you the quotes to check for accuracy, but I have recorded everything as well, and I don't say this in the email because I don't want it on paper, but generally as a courtesy, if I paraphrase somebody, I will give them those parts too, they can kind of steer, well, especially when you paraphrase, like I didn't quite mean it like that, especially with people I have to remain friends with. But I also don't understand why they want to check everything. These are all people who had extensive media training. Like you should also trust the people you let talk to journalists to actually know what they're saying at the moment they're saying it. It's very weird that we're acting like this is not the kind of thing. If I interview a woman who wants to end her life with the euthanasia pill, I'm going to show her more of the article because this is not a woman who has had media training and who doesn't know how it will look in an article. But a Dutch minister, you know, I expect him or her to fully know what it's going to look like in the media. So why would you want to see it back? It's so strange.
Ja.
Het is een manier om controlfreak te zijn. En dat is wat me echt soms...
Especially when you record interviews.
Waarom moet men alles controleren, weet je? Dat werkt averechts, vind ik. Ja, inderdaad.
Helmut, you had a comment? Last question?
If you allow me, I would like to put forward another question. And it's a little bit a question which concerns all of us. So we are in the middle of a huge communication revolution, social media, internet, and so on. You all know that. I do not have to explain that. My question to you all is, as a colleague, what do you think? Is it for you, and you now more easy or more difficult to report and broadcast about the Netherlands? So as I said, as Bill Clinton said, small country, big footprint. So is it more, or to make it very populistic, more easy or more difficult to sell the Netherlands in the news?
Then when?
Yeah. It depends. Then maybe for the revolution, it started in 1990 with internet. Okay, and now we are in 2021. So a lot has changed. The whole communication landscape in the world has changed completely. And we are competing very hard. And everything has changed completely. And I'm long in the business, 40 years now, as a foreign correspondent, first serving in China and in the Netherlands and in the US and so on. And I know what has happened, but I would like to listen to your valued opinion, my dear colleagues.
I'm not going to shame anybody and see who the oldest is at the table who might have killed this revolution. I did have the time of the telex. I did do an internship at AP in Paris where you still had to pull the telex, but that was the last, that was already considered very ancient. And when I started, there was already internet and all those. I think... in a way, it's easier to report in the sense that you don't have to do the stupid vox pops because you can kind of use Twitter partially for that. So there is a lot less going out on the street and finding random people to comment, and you can much more targeted find people who have something to say about something. So I find Twitter very useful. I do a lot of, as Molly does, a lot of international law, and international law Twitter is very vocal and present. Yeah. And so that's a very good source of information for me. For the Netherlands themselves, I think internet has made it not necessarily more interest or less interest for me. I think it was, when you look at when I started in the Netherlands reporting for foreign media around the year 2000, there was a lot more going on internationally. We had euthanasia laws, the gay marriage, legal prostitution. Those were all huge stories, very Dutch. And so there was more international attention than for those kinds of things, and there was less other media sources competing. So when I started at AFP, you could write 800 to 1,000 words, and that was not a lot. That's like a 1.5 A4'tje. Now I have to write 300 words because that's what fits on a screen. And if I want more than 300 words, I have to get permission from the editor in London to make it a big story. So in that way, the internet, on the one hand, it's made all this information easier to access. On the other hand, it's meant that we have to condense what we write very much. So it's Now, Matt, I'm going to go to you. Do you see a big change in how you report with social media, for example?
I think it makes it harder because the subjects that are under discussion are more likely to be the same internationally. And when you're selling, if you're talking about, is it easier to report about the Netherlands? Part of what you're trying to do is sell an idea of difference, like an idea of a country as being different from other places. And it's the subjects under discussion are less different. There's less people are occupied with, it's the same sets of celebrities all over the place. And so it makes it harder to do that sort of exoticism that you need to do a bit of in order to introduce people to the country.
Yeah, Britta?
I think that for a television person and for social media, the Netherlands are a very good country to report on, because they're very good in marketing, and I can always sell a story on tulips, wooden shoes, or windmills. So that's easy, and that's the superficial part. Is there the Netherlands really respond to a lot of things that are wanted on social media. When it comes to more in-depth story, it's a bit harder.
Antoine, do you feel...
Ja, mijn gevoel is tenminste dat de belangstelling voor Nederland in Frankrijk en in Franstalige landen groter wordt. Ook, want er is een behoefte om te kijken hoe het werkt hier in Nederland, ook hoe het werkt in Denemarken. Landen die worden heel vaak genoemd in de Franse politiek als voorbeelden. De huidige Franse overheid, ons kabinet op dit moment, die kijkt heel erg in richting Nederland en Noordische landen. Hoe doen we hervormingen? En dat is precies, daar is de behoefte op dit moment. Want we willen gewoon weten hoe het echt werkt. Werkt het? Is het goed? Is het positief? Is het een negatief? Is het een slechte idee? En tegelijk heb je ook al die ruzie tussen Nederland en zuidelijke Europese landen op dit moment, die ook meespeelt. Dus nu dat Fransen beginnen te merken dat ten eerste ze worden in Nederland als een Zuid-Europese land beschouwd. Want in Frankrijk is er altijd het idee van nee, in Zuid-Europa gaat het economisch slecht. Bij ons hebben we op dit moment problemen, maar we zijn niet op hetzelfde niveau. Hier in Nederland wordt volgens mij op een heel andere manier op dit onderwerp gekeken. En nu dat het een beetje binnengedrongen is, merk ik dat ik ontvang veel bestellingen. Dus ik moet veel meer reportages doen over zulke thematieken. Hoe Nederland heeft het over Frankrijk. En hoe zit het überhaupt qua in welke richting gaat Nederland nu? Ja.
Molly, too young to remember the time before social media.
With that, this is all I know. I don't know if I believe that it was better. I don't know.
With that humble brag, we come to the end of our discussion about polarization. Thank you all very much for taking part. Matt, Britta, Antoine, and Molly. And thanks to Nieuwsport and the Stichting Beeld en Geluid and the gemeente Den Haag for making this possible. And thanks for the audience for asking questions. And I think that is a wrap from us. Thank you very much.